Right, it's a great pleasure to be here and speaking at this conference. Some of you may know I'm trying to stand in for Hana Yamin, who was due to speak. You'll also probably know it's impossible to stand in for Hana, and certainly to fill her shoes, which would be far more expensive and tasteful than these ones which I'm sporting today. But what I will try and do is do something I think Hana was scheduled to do, which is forge some of the connections between climate change and the climate change regime and some of the sorts of issues around energy access that we're talking about today. But I'll also try and bring to bear some thoughts on the political economy aspect of all of this. Because where I come from, within politics and international relations, political economy tends to refer to the relationship between states and markets. But more broadly, the big political economy questions are around who wins, who loses, how and why. And in that sense, those types of questions could not be more pertinent to our discussions today. Why is it that 1.4 billion of the world's poor people still live without access to electricity, as we've heard this morning, in a world of energy opulence? It's not for lack of available energy, it's not for lack of finance per se. Surely it's about the lack of purchasing power of the poor. So the key question is, do those who currently exercise control over key production processes, technologies and finance have an interest in improving access to energy when the poorest probably can't pay for it? And this raises big questions in the context of conventional wisdom about the market delivering energy services in the most effective, most efficient way, as with all other services. So it raises some of these big questions, but let me try and take those down a level and in doing so try and bring in the climate change dimension in particular. And in doing that, I'll try and share some thoughts and draw on some thinking that I developed in a paper for UNDP. It was a background paper for the Human Development Report last year on pursuing clean energy equitably. And John Phillips, who sat over there, was also involved in producing that work, so any difficult questions should be fielded his way. So at the outset, I think, in thinking through the connections between the climate change debates, the climate change regime, and issues of energy access, it's obvious that energy access isn't the primary goal of the climate change regime. Neither, I think, do we have the institutional means for effectively linking issues of energy access and initiatives around it with the climate change regime. Those institutional links are very weak. And of course, if we're talking about massively expanding access to energy, depending on how that's done, you might further undermine the goals of the climate regime. So in sort of transition terms, perhaps picking up on what Andy was saying, the climate regime is a sort of landscape factor in all of this. But the presence of climate change, the severity of the issue, means that it has to inform the current debates about sustainable energy for all. But the links between the climate regime and energy access are obviously not that direct and not at all clear. They may come through technology transfer, but I think we're going to hear later on today about the ways in which that's often not happened. We've heard already some of the reasons why it hasn't happened. It may come through specific CDM projects of the sort we just heard from Linus. And of course, most activity through the CDM these days is in the energy sector, and many projects also try and make their claims about sustainable development benefits around claims of improving energy access for the poor, whether it's cooking stove projects, wind energy projects, biomass, etc. And these types of claims also feature in the use of carbon finance increasingly, whether it's the World Bank's the Clean Investment Funds, the Clean Technology Funds, scaling up renewables, etc. And of course we see controversial examples of the use of climate and carbon finance to try and improve energy access. I'm thinking, for example, of the Medupi coal-fired power plant in South Africa, which very much highlights some of these issues about, who is the energy for? What purposes is it going to be used for? Where there's a debate about, is this largely energy for industry or is it going to be energy for the poor? And to sort of touch on something that Andrew Scott was talking about earlier, you have to make a whole series of assumptions about how the poor, what are the pathways, or what are the ways in which poor people are said to benefit from large-scale interventions like that. Is it through employment? Is it by raising income, assuming that that can then be spent on energy or energy services or one sort or another? But there's a lot of assumptions woven into that I think we need to unpack, and Andrew's presentation this morning showed us why that's so important. But from a climate change point of view, there's a big sort of distributional question here, it seems to me, as well. how are we going to enable this large-scale expansion of energy use for the world's majority, while simultaneously dramatically trying to reduce emissions trajectories of over-consumers of energy? In other words, how do we also address energy profligacy? And there are proposals in the climate change negotiations, have been for a number of years, that try to deal with these sorts of issues, the right to development in a carbon-constrained world, whether it's ideas about contraction and convergence or greenhouse development rights, etc., which try to explicitly deal with these sorts of questions, but they're fairly marginal, if you like, to the mainstream debate. But assuming a fair amount of energy access going forward will either be based on fossil fuels or lower carbon alternatives, or even if it's largely provided by renewables, it will quite possibly lead to higher consumption of non-clean, in inverted commas, energy sources. So there will be net increases in emissions, quite possibly. And how will we allow for this while trying to keep warming below, I'm going to say 3 or 4 degrees. People are still talking about 2 degrees, but having worked alongside Kevin Anderson at UEA, I'm a bit more sceptical about our ability to keep warming below 2 degrees. But that's obviously the target that's on the table. And these sorts of big distributional questions are not just at the international level, how we allocate responsibility, but it also requires us to deal with the vast energy inequities within countries. This comes up in debates about hiding behind the poor, for example, countries that say their per capita emissions are very low and therefore they can afford to drastically increase, when actually the middle classes in many of the countries we're talking about are actually high consumers of energy. So we've got the internal aspect of this we need to think about clearly. But there's also a whole set of very difficult trade-offs in allocating the burdens, but hopefully also some of the opportunities that have been discussed of transitioning towards a low-carbon economy. But it does again raise these questions of energy for whom and for what, whose energy takes priority, and what are the political processes by which we try and establish that. And I'm reminded of the World Bank and its consultations around its energy strategy. This was a couple of years ago. I attended the consultation in London, and you had a complete divide in the room. On the one hand, there were many development NGOs there saying, look, the key role for the World Bank, its comparative advantage in this is to go for off-grid, small-scale renewables. That's how it should best use its money, because the big money, the big capital will still go towards the fossil fuel investments of one sort or another. And on the other side of the room, with the big industry saying no, in terms of scale, in terms of large-scale access, in terms of generating proper long-term secure employment, we're going to have to go for clean coal, for CCS, etc. But renewables just won't fit the bill. So you had this sort of very contested visions about how the finance should best be used. And what the key priorities were going forward. And the dilemma, of course, is that you could argue that reducing the carbon intensity of existing fossil fuel infrastructures can also be pro-poor, in the sense that you're trying to tackle climate change, which will hit the poor hardest. But it may do over longer time frames than the sorts of pressing energy poverty issues that I think we're talking about more today, access to basic energy services. And then within societies, there's the sort of temporal and inter-societal trade-offs. So where you have a large-scale increase in coal-fired electricity generation in China, you increase energy access to the rural poor, but it's to the detriment of environmental quality and health, etc., along the coal commodity complex. Three Gorges Dam, you generate vast amounts of energy, but there's displacement associated. So again, the key political economy questions are, who pays the social and environmental costs for whose energy, and who is it that gets to decide? So this raises then the process issues about who's involved in making these judgments, in making energy policy, and on whose behalf. And that's true, I think, whether we're talking about the Green Climate Funds, the Climate Investment Funds, down to the national level and right down to local level. It's also true around specific projects and interventions, the public acceptance of wind farms in this country, for example, which has been hugely controversial, and some sense in which if people were perhaps more involved in the projects and could see the benefits, or able to capture the benefits, there may be more interest in alternatives. But the same is true in some of the projects perhaps that we're more interested in the context of this conference. We talk about concentrated solar power in the Moroccan Atlas Mountains, but a large proportion of the energy generated will be going to Europe. So again, there's concerns about who benefits and whose energy is being generated, and who captures most benefits from it. So of course the day-to-day governance of energy in lots of ways is determined by producer or consumer power, where some of the questions about access and justice, etc., are going to be marginal, to say the least, in calculations through the market. And so this leads to the question of the just transition, which people are starting to talk about more and more. How can you make sure that the multiple pathways or the different forms of transition to a low carbon economy are fair, that they bring on board potential losers from a low carbon economy transition whose jobs and livelihoods are locked in very much to a fossil fuel economy, in mining, in oil, in the car sector, whatever it might be, trying to be explicit about the trade-offs involved, about what compensation, retraining, new opportunities will look like. Part of this is also making the positive case, of course, in the way many people have done already so far in this conference, selling the potential that renewable energy is poor people's energy, as Earthlife South Africa, I think, has used that phrase. And we heard, I think, about an IRENA study, which was also trying to emphasise the employment creation potential for going down more of a renewables path. But we need to be explicit, I think, about what the deal is, who's going to gain what and over what sort of time frames, and how do you compensate those that will lose out, many of whom will also be very poor and not have access to energy. So we have got these case studies when people talk about just transitions, about how communities heavily reliant on fossil fuels have undergone some sort of process of transition. Cities in Germany switching from coal and trying to develop a solar base, Hunter Valley in Australia, etc. There's a sort of growing literature highlighting particular case studies of where these sorts of things have been dealt with. But the sorts of challenges we're talking about in this conference, I think, require a huge scaling up of that when we're trying to talk about decoupling strategies of energy use from growth in the way that Kevin alluded to this morning. But let me just throw in one other element on the just transition issue, which might be about trying to address inequities and injustices in the production and supply of energy technologies. So I'm thinking about solar PV, the use of toxic chemicals by immigrant labour in many instances. Trying to ensure if there is going to be a large-scale enrolment of particular technologies, that it's done in a just and environmentally sensitive way. Likewise, through coming back to CDM, instances of land displacement to make way for wind energy projects, etc. I think we need to be acutely aware of the forms of poverty that we're talking about, and not just fetishise energy poverty per se, and be aware about the ways in which poverty might be created by the production of so-called clean energy technologies as well. And let me end just with a question and a reflection on strategy, which is really comes back to this issue which we address in the book Climate Capitalism. How do you get people with power and money to bring that power and those resources to bear on energy access? And it strikes me there's sort of two parts to this. One is, how can you change the rules of the game in the global energy economy so that continued investments in fossil fuels look increasingly risky and unattractive? And of course there's many initiatives that are trying to do this, whether it's Carbon Disclosure Project, rise in shareholder activism, carbon trading, trying to create coalitions of the willing and the willing, those that have a material interest in trying to see emissions come down. But the second and the harder bit for us, I think, in the context of this discussion, is how do you make it attractive to producers and investors to provide energy to the poor who often can't pay for it? Now, engaging the private sector is obviously key for all the reasons that have already been spelled out. And ODA is less than 10% the size of foreign direct investment flows in the energy sector. So donors have a role to play, but there's clearly a much bigger picture. At the same time, this is according to Practical Action figures, I think from Deo Sanchez, in fact, universal basic energy access is less than 3% of global energy investment to 2030, and so would add little to overall carbon emissions. So what are the ways in which we can lever private sector investment to try and tackle some of these challenges? There's been mention of regulation, of subsidies, of tax breaks, innovative planning, smart grids perhaps, a whole range of different things. But a political economy question is also how many of those tools and policies and instruments are realistically available to most of the countries that we're talking about, the very poorest. Are they really going to be able to screen energy investments on their own terms and assert their own developmental preferences, I wonder. And of course there's interesting innovations and use of policy instruments out there, but a concern I have, again, and it's very much a political economy issue, is when we talk about transitions, we're talking about steering, guiding, we're talking about strategic large-scale interventions which imply a big role for the state. This of course happens at the very time that many states have ceded some control over their energy sectors through processes of liberalisation and privatisation. So what does this imply? You know, what are the tools that states realistically have available to them that they can employ in the context of the current political economy? And in a carbon-constrained world, who, i.e. which actors, and what, which tools, which types of interventions, are going to address energy profligacy such that the necessary growth that we're imagining in energy access for the 1.4 billion people currently without it can be accommodated whilst trying to keep carbon emissions warming below 3 or even 4 degrees warming. And there's some quick fix measures, you might argue, like dealing with the 600 billion a year US dollars that go on fossil fuel subsidies. But again, I think it's only 100 billion of that goes directly to producers, the rest is to consumers, and so there's a lot of very poor people that would also be targeted by trying to deal with those issues. And so I think there are many powerful actors out there that might be keen to expand energy use, but maybe less keen and less interested in energy access. So if you ask big coal, oil and gas companies, should we have a sustainable energy revolution, they would probably say yes. They would have no problems with sustainable energy for all, as long as it's about more production and more consumption. They would have more problems perhaps if you're talking about reducing production and consumption of highly profitable energy-related activities in which they're involved, and that strikes me as the tricky question. We could end up with sustainable energy for the world's poor and unsustainable energy for the world's rich, who seem intent on extracting every last barrel of oil through more and more extreme strategies around the tar sands, shale gas, fracking, etc. So there's few signs of restraint, if you like, on those that have most energy. And so the political economy questions for me about how you reconcile some of these competing demands. Because it's currently the case, I think, that neither the climate change regime, which is obviously still struggling to formulate a post-Kyoto legally binding agreement, nor carbon markets, whose value is at a record low, are sending strong enough signals to the world of industry and finance, the private sector that we're talking about that's going to be supposedly rolling out these solutions. So I think, you know, we need to be realistic about what's possible and how ultimately we can try and free up the ecological space, if you like, in a carbon-constrained world for the massive expansion of energy access that we want to see, whilst trying to restrain the overuse of fossil fuels by the world's rich. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Pete. So we're going to open up the floor to questions now. I think we've got a good 20 minutes for discussion available. I mean, I found those presentations very illuminating. I think they did a really good job of